The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
The end of this is their Dr. Max.
Mic test, test 1, 2. I wish I didn't have to do this back and forth. I wish we had lapel mics. Are we on now? Okay. For the benefit of those of you who will view the videotape from time to time, we would like to inform you that we are taping a radio program that will be broadcast on our program Insight, which is overseen by the Druid Hills Church of Christ in Atlanta, Georgia. Insight is on 156 stations across our country. It's a weekly program, and it's aired as a public service on all of them. September the 11th through the 14th, 1978, at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, a debate was held of great importance. The proposition of the debate, stated in the positive, is as follows. I believe that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who shall punish some eternally in hell, does exist. Affirming this proposition was Dr. Thomas Warren, professor of philosophy and apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Denying this proposition and taking the atheistic position was Dr. Wallace Matson, professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. Gentlemen, it's the morning after the debate, and both of you are exhausted, I know, and because of this, and of course other reasons, we are very grateful that you've granted this interview. Dr. Matson and Dr. Warren, I want to ask both of you this question and get perhaps a short response to it. And Dr. Matson, I'll address it to you first. No doubt you had some ideas as to what the debate was going to be like, and maybe you could anticipate some of the things that Dr. Warren, the positions that he was going to take. But were there any surprises? Anything that you hadn't expected?
Well, before I answer that question, I know that Dr. Warren is also hankering to make a slight correction in what you said about the subject we were debating. Instead of "I believe,"
Yes,
and all we had to do was show that we did believe it. I know.
I made a mental note that when somewhere I was going to correct it.
I'll try to answer your question. Well, I had read the book of the Warren debate when I came, and I assumed that it would be somewhat along those lines, and I think it was more along those lines than I even thought it would be.
Okay. Dr. Warren, any surprises?
No, not really. I anticipated that Dr. Matson would follow pretty well his book, The Existence of God, which of course I had studied very carefully, and that he would study the Warren-Flew debate and perhaps would be influenced by some of the things that Dr. Flew had argued. And I think that did occur. It seemed to me at times that he did go back on some of the things he said in his book, though, as Dr. Matson has said, he didn't feel that he did. But of course, we don't want to rehash that here now, but in answer to your question, I'd say that'd be about the only surprise so far as I'm concerned.
Could I say some more about that?
Certainly.
Well, there was one major difference that should be pointed out, and that is that in the statement of the proposition with Flew, there was no mention of hell, and there was in this one. Consequently, that led to some different consideration.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But as a matter of fact, the Flew debate involved exactly the same God. And Dr. Flew and I both recognize that because the question of eternal punishment was introduced in the Flew debate, and we discussed it. There was no objection upon my part when he introduced it to say, oh, this isn't in the proposition, because we both well understood that we were discussing the God of the Bible just as we were in this debate. There's really no difference. That parenthetical statement really made no difference in the two debates as far as I'm concerned.
When I mentioned a moment ago the proposition was, I know that God exists. And then, of course, Dr. Wallace, Dr. Matson taking the position, I know that God does not exist. Now, Dr. Matson, you stated...
If I interrupt here.
All right.
You see, that's one place where this does matter. While I'm not averse to other formulations of my belief, the actual one was about the God who presides over hell. And this does make a difference in what you have to prove if you're to be considered to have established your case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, with that emphasis or definition of God, you have to prove that this God, who shall punish some eternally in hell, does not exist. What proof?
That it's a contradictory notion, because you can't be good and eternally torment anybody or anything.
Dr. Warren, you, of course, both of you commented upon this extensively in the debate. And again, we don't want to rehash the debate, but your answers to this point. I'll go ahead and hold it.
Well, it's simply that it was not contradictory. It would be contradictory to hold that God is infinite and to hold that he is infinite in goodness, but not infinite in justice. And the biblical position is set forth in passages such as Romans chapter 11, verse 22, where the Apostle Paul says, behold then the goodness and the severity of God. Now that really is a way of saying, recognize the fact that God is not only infinite in goodness or love and mercy, he is infinite in justice, holiness, and righteousness. And this means that in spite of the fact, not I should say in spite of, but as a part of the total picture of God, you recognize that he loves perfectly, but he is also perfect or infinite in justice. He cannot tolerate sin. If God were a God who could tolerate sin, then he would not be a God that I could worship. And what is a fundamental thing that I think atheists and agnostics overlook, that it becomes a stumbling block to them so far as God is concerned, is that they do not see the matter of the retribution for sin. The fundamental idea in punishment, while there is also deterrence and reformation, and the Bible does deal with this, It urges us to recognize we should not go into sin because there will be consequences. It urges us to recognize that if we do go into sin, we should come out of it because there will be consequences. But deterrence and reformation are not the basic fundamental. The fundamental thing to recognize about sin is that it really deserves death. This, of course, refers to spiritual death, separation from God. The Apostle Paul said in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. The Greek word opsonion there means, in fact, it's the word that's used in ordinary language of everyday life in the days the New Testament was written, in regard to like a soldier receiving his wages. If I agree with a man that I will work for him for $10 an hour and I work 3 hours, he owes me $30. That's what I have earned. What a person earns by a life of disobedience to God is death, and that simply means separation from God. That's the essential idea. Heaven is described in symbolic terms. Heaven is not a literal city of an actual cubic dimensions made with walls of jasper and gates of pearl and streets of gold. This is God's way of letting us know that it's wonderful beyond our finite ability to really grasp. So that in effect, when we go to heaven, I suspect we'll say, Lord, if I'd only known how wonderful it is to be here, it would have been easier even to have lived the Christian life. And on the other hand, hell is described in terms of letting us know that we're going to be separated from God and everything that's good. That's the point. And we have to understand that it's what we deserve. Just as I talked about, that one reason our criminal justice system is breaking down in this country is that we are leaving the criminal with no sense of retribution, that he's rather being mistreated instead of getting what he deserves. Now, I'm sympathetic with men who do not understand this element of God, but there is no contradiction between goodness and justice. And I kindly disagree with Dr. Matson to hold that this alleged contradiction constitutes any basis. It's a purely conceptual argument. It isn't based on any actual existing fact, whereas my argument is based upon reasoning from actual existence to the actual existence of God.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Matson, before you respond, I'm going to make an adjustment in our recorder. Okay, now we can proceed. I recall one thing that you...
May I respond to that?
Okay, I was going to lead into a question that would bring up something that maybe you would want to. And let me say this so that we can get your deepest and you said that vulgar might not be appropriate, colloquial or whatever, but you said that if God loves me, and Dr. Warren had said in one of his speeches that God loves all people, and of course that would include Wallace Matson, and you said if I wake up in hell, then I'm going to say something like, with friends like this, who needs enemies? Okay.
Well, yes, I said that, and I didn't exactly time these, but it seems to me that in answer to your previous question, I took about maybe 10 seconds, and you heard how long Dr. Warren did.
You have an equal amount of time, right?
It's not that. I just wanted to point out that Dr. Warren seems to agree with no less a figure than Oscar Wilde, of all people, that the truth is seldom pure and never simple. I don't myself.
When you say it's a contradiction...
May I respond to that?
All right. But we said we weren't going to do this.
The truth of the matter is, however, that the simple statement of Romans 11:22 takes care of that. Behold then the goodness and the severity of God, where Paul says that if you live in belief and loving submission to God, then you will receive an eternity of blessedness. And on the other hand, if you reject it, then you will not. It's just really just that simple. There's nothing wrong with explaining the basic simple statement, however.
Now, when you say it's a contradiction of terms, in other words, do you mean logically contradictory? Yes. That you cannot be good and you cannot punish someone at the same time?
You cannot be good and punish anyone eternally. The term good, Dr. Warren, it is very clear, wants to withhold the term good from the conduct of Adolf Hitler. But the worst that Hitler did was gas people and then cremate their dead bodies, whereas his God cremates their conscious bodies forever. So I cannot see any possibility of calling Hitler bad and God good and using the words in anything like the same term. I say when you stretch terms that far, triangle can mean 17-sided figure. But I think we are rehearsing the debate, you know.
Yes, I do too. And both of you, I know that we could spend 27 hours and still.
But I do need to say something about that.
All right.
The truth of the matter is, a contradiction is like when you have M and not M. It's not just sort of talking in general terms. The law of contradiction, in effect, says it is false to say that M and not M. It is false to say that proposition M is true and that proposition M is false. Now, the two propositions that Dr. Matson is talking about are these: God is good and God is just. Now, he has not shown that there is a contradiction between those two. There would rather be contradiction between saying God is infinite and then saying he is infinite in goodness, but he is not infinite in justice. And so the contradiction involved lies in Dr. Matson's position and not in the biblical position.
Dr. Warren, let me ask you.
Right, I have to reply to that.
Okay.
God's justice. There are various basic or minimal requirements for justice, is the word. And one is that the judge should be a disinterested party, which God obviously cannot be. And this is why I don't think it makes sense to talk about the justice of God. He is creator of the defendant and prosecutor and alleged victim all at once. Now, this is not a situation you can have in a courtroom.
Dr. Warren, now you said...
I'm afraid I need to respond to that.
Okay, now I think this question will help you do this. If you were to try, and this is almost impossible for any person to do, but to be as objective as possible, separating your own Christian commitment to the Word of God, and just as a human being, does eternity in hell, does this in any way go against the grain of your sense of justice? I mean, can you conceive of eternity in hell and this being justice for any person, just you as a human being?
Now, what you're asking here involves, I suppose, you're saying, envision yourself as a person who is not a theist.
Yes.
All right, here I'm going along someday and I'm wondering, perhaps I'm agnostic. I say, I don't know whether God exists or not. Or perhaps I say, at this point in my life, I'm an atheist, but at least I wonder about this thing. And now I say, well, what if an infinite being? What if the self-existent being? What if the being that I have heard some people mention, or that is mentioned in the Bible? Perhaps I don't know a great deal about what the Bible says about him, other than that he is the infinite self-existent being. As God identified himself to Moses in Exodus 3, I am that I am. And as it says in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The word was there is the imperfect of the Greek verb eimi, which means he already was at the beginning. This indicates eternity. All right, now I'm going to envision this. I say, from my standpoint, this will be, at presently at least, a counterfactual hypothesis. Now I'm thinking about the infinite being. Now I'm going to contemplate the possibility that I will contradict his will, or that I will live out of harmony with his will. All right then, what should be the result of that? Now, how am I to determine what is the enormity of the violation of the will of this infinite being? And I suggest to you that I have no platform upon which to decide it. Now, if I may interject this much, Dr. Matson said that it would be wrong for God even to have given Hitler a slight slap on the wrist. You see, eternal hell isn't his only problem. He has a problem with God even tapping Hitler on the wrist for all that he did to those Jews. So eternal hell isn't his problem. It's any punishment at all. But now the Bible makes clear that God's message is that punishment will be eternal. Now, I have no way of knowing what ought to be the result of violation of the will of the infinite being, except that infinite being would reveal it to me. And it simply does not fit this analogical argument that Dr. Matson has given about the judge here in the ordinary case. It costs the Son of God for me to have a way out of it. God lets me know there what one sin is. Adam and Eve were put out of the garden for one sin. That lets me know something about what sin is. And the cost, if I live in willful disobedience and die in it, lets me know that I deserve an eternity away from God. Now, I would have no basis whatever as a person simply contemplating that, allegedly as a disinterested party, trying to think counterfactually to my basic hypothesis that I don't really deserve that. How could I say that I don't deserve that if I, as a free creature of God, have rejected him? I have no basis, and I think that Dr. Matson's point simply does not stand at all.
Okay, let's move into another area. And I'm going to ask Dr. Warren this question, and of course, Dr. Matson, you can respond. You said repeatedly that if God does not exist, then all things had to begin from nothing. But you stated emphatically that's logically impossible.
Well, I didn't say it quite that way. I said the atheistic position entails eternality of matter. That if indeed, given the atheistic position, if ever there were a moment that nothing existed, then nothing ever would exist. And there would be nothing existing now. But there is the actual fact of actual existing objects. The objects with which we have empirical experience are contingent. I'm contingent. I can't account for my own existence. It's possible that I would not exist. So with you, so with Dr. Matson. But given the atheistic position, there must be eternality of matter. He cannot prove it. There must also be the move from non-living matter to living matter. That he cannot prove. There must be the move from living matter, which is not human, to living matter, which is human, and that he cannot prove. Now, to try to counter that, just as Dr. Flew did, Dr. Matson invented what is absolutely an untenable situation, things that are neither human nor non-human. Now, he may say, well, but it's difficult to define human. It doesn't matter how difficult to define anything is. Everything that exists is either black or not black. Everything that exists is either a rock or it isn't a rock. Everything that exists is either human or it's not human. Now, they simply cannot handle this move from non-living matter to life, from living matter, which is not human, to human, and to answer the question, which was first on earth, a woman or a baby. Seems very simple, but you know, the Bible makes clear that the facts about God and what to do is evident even to the common man. You don't have to be a university professor or hold a bachelor, master's, or doctor's degree to know how to respond to that.
Dr. Matson, did you say I don't need to know how life came into existence?
Well, I don't remember saying it, no.
I thought I wrote it in my notes.
I did?
I thought you did.
Well, I don't remember the context of that. In general, I did make some remarks that I didn't need to know this or that in order to establish my proposition, since it was sufficient to show that the negation was contradictory. If we didn't know how life originated, then we wouldn't know, would we? But we have very good scientific evidence on the point now, as I tried to explain last night.
How did life originate?
About 1 billion years after the creation of the Earth, by the final polymerization of amino acids into one-celled organisms without nuclei.
Sounds rather simple to me. Do you agree with that?
It sounds very assertive to me, and its extrapolation back from the present situation to mere assertion. It's the kind of thing that if we were to present that sort of argument for the existence of God would really be laughed out of court by atheists. To say, oh, well, you can take this fact and then reason to the existence of something you haven't experienced. Of course, they haven't experienced such a thing as that. It's extrapolation back into that situation. And within human experience, nothing living comes from that which is not living. If Dr. Matson were at one moment the only thing so far as he knew existed and came into contact with a block of granite, he'd have absolutely no reason whatever to conclude that that block of granite was ever going to produce life, and that life then from that would come about to the complexity of the human organism. The truth of the matter is there are certain facts about each human being that make evolution absolutely impossible. The time frame, and I use that expression advisedly, we have a 5-minute interval there from the time your heart stops and this interchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, which simply makes it impossible. This is not a probability argument. It makes it impossible for the complexity of the human cardiovascular system to have evolved. And if there is no evolution, then there is no atheism. And besides that, to look at contradictions. Now, Dr. Matson has tried to say, and notice his argument is a priori. It doesn't really have anything to do with experience. He's arguing strictly from concept. He's arguing concept of God, concept of evil. Therefore, God does not exist. He's arguing strictly from concept to non-existence of God.
Let me ask Dr. Matson to respond to that.
Well,
Are you arguing?
finished, but that's
Okay.
all right.
Are you arguing just from concept?
Well, Dr. Warren brought up a lot of stuff. I mean, he betrayed most abysmal misconceptions about what evolution is all about, as he has throughout these nights. And then he brought in this business about the concept. What do you want me to respond to? Which of them?
Okay, this latter point, that he says you are arguing only from concept and not empirical evidence.
I argued from concept in two cases. One, in my two arguments against the possibility of the existence of a good God who runs hell existing. One was a general argument that I couldn't be punished after death because I'd be dead, which may sound rather simple, but I think I gave it adequate exposition. And the other, the one we've already mentioned, that you can't be good and do those things. Those are conceptual arguments. But we did get on to the questions of evolution. I'm sorry we did, and I struggled to no avail to clear up some of these matters.
Okay. Now continue, if you will.
The truth of the matter is there's been no argument formulated, no sound argument, a valid argument, true premises, the conclusion of which is, therefore I know that human life as it now exists on Earth owes its ultimate origin to evolution from non-living matter. I've discussed this with professional scientists. Really, as I've indicated in the discussion, it is not strictly a scientific problem. It's a philosophic problem and our revelational problem. No biologist is going to say, I'll stake my whole case on just going in the biological laboratory and proving to you that evolution occurred. They all try to gain data from the various disciplines. And to synthesize that is really a philosophical problem. You're not functioning as a scientist when you do that. And of course, we have the Bible as revelation. You can prove the Bible to be the Word of God. And the Bible plainly declares, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and makes clear that God created man. Now, the conceptual argument that he's talked about, as I just want to repeat, that there is no contradiction between the infinite goodness of God and the infinite justice of God. That's nothing but a figment of Dr. Matson's imagination.
You wish to make a comment before we go to another point?
I think not.
Okay. Dr. Matson, you were quoted in the press as saying, and these things can get misquoted so easily, but that Christians are irrational. Did you say that? And if so, do you believe it?
Well, I may have. I don't want to accuse a reporter of misquotation. I may have said it, and if so, I don't remember what I was surrounded by. I certainly would state that doctrines such as Dr. Warren peddles here are as irrational as anything I have ever heard, and I guess they're Christian doctrines. At least I'm sure Dr. Warren is convinced that they are. that Christians are irrational might be taken as meaning that every Christian is totally unreasonable at all times in all respects, and I certainly wouldn't want to say anything like that, not even about Dr. Warren.
Dr. Warren mentioned a number of times in the debate that an atheist cannot say that anything is wrong within itself or right within itself. Adultery cannot be wrong. Murder cannot be wrong. Do you agree with that?
Well, of course that's false, because I say it all the time, and I'm an atheist. I guess what he means is that I don't have a right to do so, but I have as much right as he has, and indeed more, since I base my claims as to what is right and wrong on the nature of things, whereas he bases his on the completely arbitrary command of a postulated being. These commands, by the way, really simply coming from certain ancient priests who chose to give them dignity by prefacing them with, "The Lord spake unto me and said so-and-so."
Okay.
My experience has been with agnostic and atheistic professors in various universities, where I've been as a student and where I've corresponded with them and read their materials. And when you are actually in conversation with them, even in contrast to what they will allege previously on their own, in their lectures and their articles, that they castigate Christians for being irrational, that we ought to draw only such conclusions as are warranted by the evidence. This is known as the law of rationality. And the laws of thought, the law of identity, that if a proposition's true, then it's true. And if an object has a certain property, then it has it. The law of excluded middle. Every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. Dr. Matson himself, you see, admitted that in the debate, but then he denied it for objects. It's a rather strange situation that he admits the law of excluded middle for propositions, but then denies it for objects. Now, the law of excluded middle for objects is that every object either has a certain property or it doesn't. Now, that means that everything that exists is either human or it is not human. And yet both he and Dr. Flew, to even try to stay in the discussions in this matter of which was first on earth a woman or a human baby, had to invent this middle ground of things that were neither human nor non-human. Now, I have a very dear friend who has a child about 4 years of age who's retarded. Now, he might very well say that this little child is not human. Well, he'd be a candidate for the oven, perhaps, given the Nazi line of thinking. And I don't see that Dr. Matson would really have any way of avoiding that. It's that kind of thinking that has led to the terrible monstrosities of action in the communist world, and that's going on in Cambodia today. Now, to recognize the law of rationality, to say it, and then to say, well, we ought to recognize the law of excluded middle and the law of contradiction, but then to come into discussion and say, oh, but here are objects that neither possess this property nor have it, is really about as absurd as anything that I've ever heard. Now, the truth of the matter is, Christianity demands, it not only urges, it demands that we be rational. Notice carefully, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, the instructions given by the Holy Spirit through the Apostle Paul. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Now, that's why I formulated my arguments precisely. Every argument I presented was valid. Dr. Matson made no objection. He did not say that a single argument I presented was invalid. That's why I put them on charts where he and everybody else could see them, where they can be seen in the book. I then proved every premise involved. Now, when you have a valid argument and every premise is shown to be true, you have a sound argument. When you have a sound argument, the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed. Now, that's what it means to be rational. The law of rationality is you ought to justify your conclusion by adequate evidence and not to make assertions. As Dr. Matson's basic approach was, can't you see that? Over and over and over and over again, we went over that. Can't you see that? He said he saw it, and he saw no reason why we shouldn't see it. But, you know, people say, can't you see that if two people just take up living together and not doing any harm to anybody else, that's all right? Can't you just see if men live with men sexually, that's all right? can't you just see that if 10 men and 10 women want to join together in a group marriage and all of them having marital privileges with each other, that's all right? But what about the fellow who says, no, I can't see it, and it's wrong, and turns around and says, can't you just see that it's wrong? Then you see you have a contradiction. Now follow this carefully. Now this is rationality. If atheism is true, then subjectivity is true. I've just shown that. If subjectivity is true, then you have contradictory views, and you have to say, if you're an atheist, they're both right. Dr. Matson might say he doesn't like the other fellow's viewpoint, but he can't say it's wrong, because that man can be saying the same thing he does. Can't you see that what I'm saying is right? Now then, that would then follow that if the consequent of this premise, if subjectivity is wrong, then A and not A, say adultery or fornication. Let's put it F and not F. If S, then F and not F. There, S implies a logical contradiction. But F and not F is false. That's the law of contradiction. If a man denies the law of contradiction, he has even cut out the ground for even beginning to think. Now that means, by what we call in logic modus tollens, that the antecedent is false. That means subjectivity is false. But remember that subjectivity is the consequent or implication of atheism, and if you deny that consequence, it means atheism is false, and therefore I have proved atheism is false. Now that's rational. Now the accusation that Christianity is irrational is as false as anything could be.
This shows how dangerous, what a dangerous thing a little logic is. Dr. Warren opposes to 2 centuries of cooperative effort in biology, paleontology, and genetics, to mention only a few, the following argument. If evolution is true, then some non-human mother had a human baby, or else some non-human thing started becoming human, and he challenges me to name when it happened. He brought this against Anthony Flew, and Flew tried valiantly to show him some things about continuity, but failed utterly. Well, I made another attempt. I tried to show Dr. Warren that if he, that by an exactly similar argument, he can show how absurd it is that Spanish evolved from Latin, and I don't think even he would want to deny that it did, though. He said, oh, well, but if you precisely define anything, then you can answer yes or no, is it or isn't it? That's the law of excluded middle. In other words, there is an answer to the question, or at least God knows the answer to the question, what was the first sentence spoken in Spanish? Well, I deny this. I deny that, for example, there is a yes or no answer to the question, is France hexagonal? And I don't care how you define hexagonal. Define it any way you like. It's still a good question. But if Dr. Warren wants, we could, it would always be open to us to say that at midnight, December 31st, 500 AD, all the people in Spain stopped speaking Low Latin and started speaking Old Castilian, Old Catalan, and so on. I guess that wouldn't be exactly false. The trouble is that it's both useless to say a thing like that, because it gives the aura of precision where it doesn't exist, and doesn't exist in the nature of things, please notice. And it also leads to misleading comparisons. That's like saying that at midnight on December 31st, 1968, the Swedes stopped driving on the left-hand side and started driving on the right-hand side, which is true, and which is a discontinuity. But I've been quite unable to get this point across to Dr. Warren. It may perhaps get across to some of your listeners. Dr. Warren has read logic books and consequently is aware that you mustn't ask the question, have you stopped beating your wife? It is evidently news to him that there are other kinds of questions you mustn't ask, such as, is it true that France is hexagonal? Or, if evolution occurred, who was the first human baby? And so on.
We're going to need to interrupt just for a second to make some adjustments in our equipment, and we'll come right back. I know that I remember the last point. Do you?
France hexagonal.
All right. Why don't you just go ahead and continue, and I won't need to say anything. Dr. Warren?
Okay, Dr. Matson said there's some questions you shouldn't ask, such as, is France hexagonal? Now, the law of excluded middle has to do not with asking questions, but making precisely stated propositions. The law of excluded middle relates both to propositions and to objects. Now, as it relates to propositions, it says every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. Now, I'm not alone in believing that, because Dr. Matson himself answered a question in a debate. He answered it true. He said every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. Now, there are good treatments in logic books on this particular matter, as men have raised objections and said, but look how difficult it is to define certain things. How do you define and ever determine whether a man is bald-headed or not? Well, it determines on how precisely you wish to speak. Ordinarily, we look at a fellow and say, well, he's bald. We don't know how many hairs he has on his head or not.
I didn't know you were going to get personal with
this. But if you really want to be precise and say, well, look, this is a really important matter, and we've got to decide exactly how many hairs on a man's head will mean that he's bald. All right, suppose we decide that if he has 100 hairs on his head, he's not bald. If he has less than that, then he is bald. All right, I make the statement, not ask the question. I make the statement that this man, John Jones, is bald. All right, now that statement is true or false. And Dr. Matson has not said anything that discounts that. If he has 100 or more hairs on his head, given this precise definition, then it's a true statement. If he has less than that, it is a false statement. Now let's take his illustration about France and the quality of being hexagonal. If I make the statement, France is a nation which has a hexagonal shape, that happens to be a false statement. Dr. Matson would lead us to believe it's a sort of thing that's neither true nor false. It depends on how precise you want to be about language. Now, of course, languages are changing. There'll be words in our language today that were not there last month. There'll be expressions that wouldn't have meant anything a year or two ago. But if you say, now, what I mean by English is the exact vocabulary and all the syntaxes involved on the morning of September 15th, 1978. Now, if a person speaks and uses only that vocabulary and only that syntax, then he is speaking English. But if he uses some other vocabulary, more words or less words or some different syntax, then he is not speaking English. So the problem isn't difficult at all. Dr. Matson's illustration doesn't touch top, side, edge, or bottom of the law of excluded middle. It still remains that every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. And remember, we are dealing here with a precisely stated proposition. A woman was first on earth before any human baby, or a human baby was on earth before any woman. Now, neither Dr. Flew nor Dr. Matson can answer that in harmony with their atheistic theory. They invent all of this gradualness and illustration about ladders and ramps and so forth in an effort to avoid the force of that, because they cannot answer it in harmony with their atheistic theory. And all that he had to say about France and language and so forth does not detract from that one iota.
All this talk about the law of excluded middle, of course, is entirely a red herring. I will not follow Dr. Warren's precedent and infer from that Dr. Warren is associated with communists. But I have, of course, answered these remarks already, even in this interview. If it will make Dr. Warren happier, we can say that, no, France isn't hexagonal. But this will, of course, prevent us from saying something that's rather useful to the student of geography. If we want, we can say when exactly was the first sentence in Spanish, but it will be an entirely arbitrary choice. If we want, we can say, as I said last night, that the first human being was the first baby born after midnight, December 31st, 1,500,000 BC. But why should we want to say such things? If we want to define a human being as a primate with a brain capacity of at least 1,100 cubic centimeters, then the first one that attained that was the first human being. But this is an entirely useless kind of consideration.
Well, maybe this is what I was referring to a moment ago. By implication, then, you said it makes no difference how life got here.
Well, I don't
Do you see
see,
my point?
no, I don't see that that has any connection with that.
Crazy, Dr. Matson.
Well, my point was that if it, in other words, you said, repeat your latter statement. I think it's a very important point that you said it's senseless to worry about this, or it's senseless to talk about
No,
it?
we're talking about Dr. Warren's hang-up on just when did the non-human turn into the human, not the origin of life, I think.
Yes, right.
Okay, well, maybe I missed
But
it.
now I want you to notice a very significant thing, that in spite of the fact that in the debate he answered, when I asked the question, was any human being now living, or any human being that's ever lived in the past, were they born of some ape or some non-human thing? And he answered false. I asked, is there any human now living, or that has ever lived in the past, that was transformed from some non-human thing, or some ape or some other non-human thing? And he answered false. So he ruled out both birth from some non-human thing and transformation from some non-human thing. And now here he argues from some non-human thing. Now notice he says, well, it may have been that the first human baby was born, I don't remember how many years ago. He said, I'll say by sake of illustration, 3 million years ago at midnight on a certain day. Well, there you see he's saying the first human baby was born of something non-human. And there he goes squarely in the face of what he answered in the written questions in this debate. The truth of the matter is there's absolutely no evidence whatever that any human being was ever born of something non-human. That's why they invented this middle ground here of something that was neither human nor non-human, and it's what got Dr. Flew into what Dr. Matson labeled as a terrible blunder of saying that senile people were neither human nor non-human. I wonder if he'd say this little 4-year-old retarded boy who is a lovable child, and the congregation where I'm a minister, everybody loves him. His mother and father love him. His brother and sister love him. I wonder if he'd say he's neither human nor non-human.
No, I said that I did say false to the statement that there are living human beings who were born of non-human or whatever it was.
You also said any human in the past ever has been on earth.
Well, I've dealt with the past, but let me finish my point. No, we can be quite sure that every human being now alive was born of human parents, fully human parents, because the transitional forms are all extinct. That's all there is to say about that.
But he also said, the question also dealt with any human being in the past. And now he just got through saying that suppose the baby was born of something, and his illustration showed that it was something non-human. Not quite there. The first human being, given that illustration used a moment ago, was a human baby, not a woman. See, if it had been a woman, he'd been in another difficulty. But now he's in this difficulty in that he's got a human baby born of something that wasn't human, when in the debate it's a position that had never happened, not now with anybody living or at any time in the past. No human that's ever lived was born of something non-human, and now here in this interview he's taking positions he has. There's no way they can stay with it.
Dr. Warren, transitional forms are transitional. That I hope you recognize as an analytic statement.
But they are not human.
It's a contradiction to say that transitional forms aren't transitional, which is what you're maintaining, or that they don't exist. Of course they exist, or did exist.
Of course, given your theory, let's talk from a counterfactual hypothesis for me. These alleged transitional forms, it still remains, let's say at split-second time t sub 1, this thing that has gradually evolved, given Dr. Matson's theory, it is still not yet human. Now, given his theory of a moment, or his explanation a moment ago, this thing that is not quite yet human, call it a transitional form. My point is, it is not human, yet he says a human being was born of it, yet in the debate he said it was not. Not now, not any human now living, not any human being that's ever been in existence anywhere was born of something non-human, and now that's the very thing he's arguing, that it was born of something non-human, and he wants to call it a transitional form. Call it that. It's a transitional form that is non-human, and therefore he's got the first human baby born of something that was non-human. And that's absolutely untenable, and that ought to convince anybody, even Dr. Matson, that atheism is false to the core.
Dr. Matson, let me ask you a personal question.
Surely.
Under what circumstance can you conceive of yourself becoming to be a believer in God? Any circumstance, whatever?
Well, sure. People like Dr. Warren would give me good reasons for it. The whole edifice of biological science is, of course, a construct of fallible human beings, and it is at least logically conceivable that this might be all pulled down, but I'm afraid it'll take more than Dr. Warren's. I hesitate to even call it a pop gun to do so.
Of course, that's an agnostic position. That's saying, well, it might be done. But the thoroughgoing atheist says, I know that God does not exist. That's it. What Dr. Matson said in answer to this very question was not what he said then, but in the debate he wrote out in writing what would convince him would be to find out that there's no such thing as eternal punishment and that there'd be reparation made for all the suffering in the past. Now, what that resolves itself, just to set it up in logical form, is this. If it should be the case that I would find out that after all there's no eternal punishment, and if there would be a reparation made for all the suffering in the past, then God would exist. But of course, that would be a very poor argument.
Dr. Matson,
Excuse me, I have to say that there are two questions confused there, but I won't be tiresome and try to straighten them out.
are you less of an atheist now than, in other words, are you more agnostic? Now, you came saying, I know God does not exist. Are you now saying maybe?
I continue to say what I said, that Dr. Warren's God, the one that runs hell, is a contradictory being, and I know that he doesn't exist, and nothing that possibly or conceivably occurred would convince me that that was false, or that I would have to change my mind on that, since it is simply a matter of logic. As for a personal first cause of the universe, I said last night that I don't suppose that's a self-contradiction. I don't see any reason to believe in such a being, but conceivably there could be some such reason. I've had a great deal of trouble with Dr. Warren in the debates, because whenever I say that maybe something is so, he's immediately interpreted that as my conceding that it is so, or even certainly is so.
Oh, no, let me correct that. When he says maybe it isn't so, I haven't said that he is then saying that it is so. I'm saying that that does not fit with saying I know that it is not so. Now, if I say I know Bill is not in this room, but he may be, then I say there's something wrong with that statement. If a fellow simply says, I don't know whether Bill is here or not, I don't take that to mean that you're saying Bill is. Dr. Matson had trouble with that all the way through the debate. I don't know why he didn't understand that. But now in the chapter in his book on evil, and the argument from evil actually includes this whole question of punishment. Dr. Flew understood that. That's why he went on into eternal punishment in our discussion in Denton. And we didn't have this parenthetical expression that we had to put in to get the propositions fixed up that would suit Dr. Matson. But notice, Dr. Matson said in the beginning of this chapter on evil, there is only one argument by which you can give positive reason for holding that God does not exist. That is, for claiming to know that God does not exist. Then down at the end of the chapter he says, but there may be some vitiating error, and that means some error that simply invalidates the whole thing. In other words, after having written the whole part comprised of a number of chapters on the single argument he's made here today and in the debate and in the book, that it just may all be wrong. Now that is agnosticism and not atheism, however much he might like to quibble about it. And I'm not saying the fact when he says, well, I may be wrong about this, that he's saying, I now admit God exists. That isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying he has to either give up his book or he has to give up the proposition he signed in this debate, because in his book he said, maybe I'm wrong, but his proposition said he knows he's not wrong, that he knows he's right, that God doesn't exist, and that surely ought to be the end of that matter.
We've got to break for adjustments on our equipment, and we'll return. Okay, now, time is gone. I've enjoyed this interview very much.
Yeah.
And Dr. Matson, I've known Dr. Warren for a number of years, but I'm meeting you for the first time, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to meet you and respect you as a man. Of course, differ with your position, but wish you the best personally and professionally throughout your life.
And Dr. Matson, let me just say that it's been good to be with you in debate, and I do appreciate you as a person, and I wish you well in every way. All that I've had to say is only against your position and not you personally. I know you understand that.
Of course, and I reciprocate the sentiments entirely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.